A virtual hug to you, Steve.
To you too. You look great.
Thank you, thank you.
I unmuted.
Carl, you look as well dressed and well kept under these circumstances as you do under normal circumstances.
Well, it's easy. You just go to the closet and pick out a shirt.
That's it. We won't ask. I don't want to know about the other half, Carl.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, let's see. I see Hank. Good to see you.
Okay.
Abby. There's my
Steve,
friend.
Aviva is having a problem coming in. Can you help?
I'll turn the light on.
Maybe.
Steve,
Stan and
you
Risa,
have to
I see you
admit,
guys.
Aviva.
Hi, Rabbi. It's Miriam. Can you see me?
I can see you. I'm going to say hi to everyone in a minute.
But why can't you?
I see Ellen and Mark. See Laura. Got Hank. Harold. I see Dana. Ivan, I see a pretty good picture of you from the 80s.
Oh, I wonder why you got that picture.
Marlene, I see you. Roy, I see you. Hey, Roy, I'm 2/3 of the way through that whiskey.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to come up with something to replenish.
Yeah, you know, these are austere times. We got.
So
I'm rationing.
Yeah,
I'm under
well.
rationing now. Linda, I see you. Hey, Esther.
Now you got me.
Stan and Risa, good to see you.
You gotta unmute yourself.
Hey, Robert, I see you.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hey.
Guest, I have to change my name.
All right, hold on. One sec. I saw Jan and Rick.
Vito is my own name.
Claudia, good to see you.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Nadine. I see lots of you. I see your names, but not your pictures. So hi to all of you too. Thomas, hello.
You got my
Talia,
picture
Eileen,
now.
Marshall, Aviva, David, Rodney, Ken, David. Got Mary on here, George, Don, Deborah, Susan, Dana, Michael, Barry, who I assume is with Nadine in the same house. Andre. So good to see all of you. Thanks for joining. Hey, Talia. Welcome back 2 months in a row. Hi, Lauren. I see you there. Ha, Lauren's doing this driving in her car. It's like carpool karaoke, but a little different. Yeah. Just don't put the mask over your eyes when you're driving, okay? Do us a favor. Huh.
There I am.
Hi, Lisa.
On, finally.
There we go. Hi, Mary. I see you. I see Claudia. I see everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Okay, I think, let me just see what time it is. 12:06. I'm going to give it let's just give it 2 more minutes because I think people are still coming in. And remember there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to make a comment or ask a question, just use the chat or just raise your hand. I can only see about 30 or so of you at a time on one screen, and there are about 50 of us on. So if I don't call on you when you raise your hand, just be patient and I'll keep flipping between screens and we'll figure it all out. Elisa, how are you?
To change that, well, that's because.
Hey, welcome. You got to unmute. I can't hear you.
I'm well, thank you.
You doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm doing
okay.
Well, thank you.
Are the walls closing in on you yet?
Not yet today.
Okay. All right. Not yet today. Right. Yep. Okay. All right. I think.
Come closer. Next to the rabbi.
Okay. All right. Let's begin. And I don't know how many of you have Bibles at home, but if you do, go ahead and get it because it'll be helpful. If I had the technical skill to put text up on the screen, I would do that, but my skills are limited. So if you have a Bible, okay, I'll just give everyone one more second to get it. So those of you who study with me, well, let's just jump in. Those of you who study with me regularly know that I say often that the Torah is always about your life. You can always find your life within the Torah, which means you can always find the Torah within your life. That sounds, very facile and cute, but I actually live that way and believe that. Whenever I study the Torah, I begin with the question of where is this in my life? Where is this text in my life? And where is my life within this text? And today is just an unbelievable demonstration and proof of the fact that the Torah is always about our lives, because this week's Torah portion, for those of you who've read it, it's about a disease. It's about plagues. It's about disease. It's about how our ancestors understood disease, and it's pretty fascinating, and how they remedied these diseases, and how they differentiated between the disease and the person, which I think is an extremely important message for all of us. So we're going to jump in, and I think I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then open it up for questions instead of kind of a free-for-all. I so wish we were all together around that table in Century City right now, but we'll do the best. We'll do the best we can. So let me just begin with a general observation about disease in the Torah and how our ancestors understood disease.
Can you give us the chapter and verse?
Yes, Tazria-Metzora. It's chapter 12, Leviticus 12:1. Okay, Leviticus 12:1. But we're actually not going to be talking about the very beginning of it. We're gonna move ahead a little bit in the text, but that's where the parsha begins. Tazria-Metzora. I should say this is one of those weeks when we read a double portion. So the Torah is divided into 54 weekly portions, and then certain holidays interrupt the flow of the reading. And obviously there are only 52 weeks in a year, and then when you add the holidays, etc., you can't read all 54 if you just read one each week. So there are certain weeks when we read a double Torah portion. This is one of those weeks. So it's both Tazria and Metzora. Okay, and that's kind of the simplest explanation. Now, let's just go back to how did our ancestors understand disease generally? And they understood it in what we think is a very modern way, but actually is a very ancient way, which is, of course, first of all, they clearly understood disease as a normal consequence of being a human being. They didn't always read metaphorical or spiritual significance to disease. I think, as Freud put it, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. They understood that definitionally, disease was a part of what it means to be human. Maimonides, this seems like a tangent, but it's not. Maimonides, 850 years ago, wrote about the causes of evil in the world. And what he was trying to do was to let God off the hook for the problem of evil in society. And he looked at evil in three different ways. He said there are three kinds of evil in the world. The first is the evil of the fact that we fall apart, that human beings, because we're made of flesh and blood, we're prone to decay. From the moment we're born, we start dying. And he said, a lot of people think this is evil. This isn't evil. This is just the consequence of being a human being. This is definitionally what it means to be human. To be human is to be subject to disease. The way he puts it is, if we are going to act upon nature, which is of course what human beings do, then nature also must be able to act upon us. If we don't want to be affected by nature, we need to be an inanimate object, like a rock. All right. So he said that disease isn't a sign of evil, it's just a design of what it means to be, it's just a sign of what it means to be human. Okay. The way the rabbis would look at it in a little broader context is they would say that everything that God created requires working on, requires human action to work on, to improve, and to, as the Torah would put it, in Genesis, if you look at the story of creation, for those of you who have Bibles, chapter 1, verse 28, God says that he creates the world for humans to subdue it, meaning that everything that was created requires us to work on it. It's not completely finished. It's not perfect. We act on nature. Nature acts on us. And that's all there is. That's half of the view. That's one view on disease. And it's very similar to the medical view of disease today. Look, this is a problem of viruses versus antibodies. And it's a pure manifestation of the susceptibility of human beings. Now, more interestingly to me, as a rabbi, is the other view, which is a parallel view in Torah and rabbinic literature to the issue of disease. And this parallel view is that disease is a physical manifestation of some kind of spiritual disorder. That when an individual or a society is afflicted with a disease or a plague, not in all cases, because the first view still holds, but in many cases, and in the case of this week's Torah portion, with this disease of leprosy, this skin affliction, disease is seen as a manifestation of a spiritual imbalance, that something is wrong within, and that something is not physical. And the disease is sent as a warning sign by God to get your house in order, to rebalance yourself spiritually. And those are the two, I can't even say competing, I would say parallel views of disease in the collective mind of the rabbis and of the Torah. One of the reasons that the rabbis held this view is that, if we're going to look a little more closely at this disease of leprosy today, is that the way it was treated by the priests had nothing to do with sanitation, had nothing to do with hygiene, had nothing to do with what we would consider to be medicine. It was treated completely differently. It was treated with isolation, and it was treated with visits from the priest, and it was treated with, at the end, with the sacrificing of animals and certain species of plants, which we're going to get into. So this is one of the reasons the rabbis say, the ancients understood that certain diseases were a spiritual problem, not a medical problem. And today, what would we call this? The mind-body connection. And it's very real. They were hip to this 3,500 years ago, 3,000 at least. Okay, so before I get into the details now of these views and how they play out in the Torah portion, I want to pause and just see if anybody has a comment or a question about this first kind of large Google Earth view of the two understandings of disease in Torah. And if anybody, you can just raise your hand or
Steve, I have a question.
Go ahead, Carl.
If that's the case on the second one, then it's more spiritual. How did they explain the affected grand rabbis who obviously had the spiritual under control?
Well, first of all, it depends on the nature of the disease, right? And what you'll see when we get into this Even Moses and Miriam, his sister, were afflicted with what the rabbis understood to be a disease caused by a spiritual imbalance. We're going to get into that. So, we're all priests, rabbis, Republicans, Democrats, young, old, we're all spiritually out of balance sometimes. I know I have been. And by the way, let me talk a little bit more about spiritual imbalance. It is by no means a sign that the person has necessarily done something wrong, Carl. I'll give you two really interesting examples. So there's this condition called tameh, which means a person is, or tuma. It means a person is unclean. It's a biblical word for unclean, but that's completely different than unsanitary. Unclean means that the person is spiritually out of balance. Now, you're put into this state of uncleanliness if you're a woman who has a child. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a woman having a child. It's the first commandment in the Torah is to be fruitful and multiply. And yet, after a woman gives birth, she's considered spiritually unclean. This is also true for someone who handles a body, who performs the mitzvah of preparing a body for funeral, for burial. That person also has to spend time outside the camp in isolation because he or she is considered tameh, spiritually unclean. Now, the mitzvah of having a child, the mitzvah of preparing a body for burial, these are not indications of some moral failure. So we know that the rabbis were a lot more sophisticated about this, and so were our ancestors in the Torah, that they understood that there are certain life experiences, like birth, like death, that throw you out of whack spiritually, that it puts you in a different place, and you can't just walk right back into society. You need to be isolated. You need time to yourself. You need to think things through. And so this idea of isolation and re-entry and this spiritual imbalance is sometimes for a positive reason. Sometimes it's because of sin. And so it's really case specific, Carl. But
So is the woman with child unclean forever?
No, there's a process by which she isolates for up to 30 days, longer if it's a girl, and then re-enters the community. This is also true, we're going to get into a little biology lesson here now. This is also true for menstruation, women who are menstruating, and for men who have a nocturnal emission. Now, what are those? That's blood and semen. These are ancient encounters with the power of life itself, with the life force itself. And that throws you. Any of us who buried a parent, we know. Any of us who's buried a loved one, we know you're out of balance for a while, right? And so this idea of the mind-body connection is sometimes for a good reason and sometimes because of sin, but it's deeply respected and recognized by our ancestors. There were life events and experiences that required you to spend some time alone, think it through, and go through some kind of ritual before you could re-enter the community. Go ahead, Elisa.
I take issue with the menstruation and the post-pregnancy and the pre-pregnancy, with child idea of needing to isolate. It seems like it's a really male-oriented perspective. And I wonder, what female, obviously no female rabbis, but
yeah,
why is that considered?
Well, you can't dispute the fact that it's in the Torah, right? I mean, you can take issue with the misunderstanding of it
Yes.
by the writers of Torah. I mean, but it's clearly there, right?
Right, I do not dispute that. I take issue with.
Now our job is to figure out why is it there? Is it there because it was a male-dominated society? Maybe, but the same holds true for a nocturnal emission. So I'm not sure we can draw that conclusion because they held themselves to the same kind of procedure. So I really, and blood, by the way, the prohibition against ingesting blood, which pagans did, of course, appears 5 times in the Torah. And it's a very important emphasis. This idea of the power of respecting the power of blood is very deep in the Torah. So I'm not sure it was misogynistic. We know of certain island cultures, for example, and if you look at if you read Anita Diamant's The Red Tent, that there's also this idea that women preferred to isolate and just be with other women at this time too. So I don't know how a feminist would look at it. I can only tell you that I think it plays out equally for men and for women. So I'm not sure it was misogynistic. It may have been ignorant.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure it's misogynistic. But the larger point is that it was no fault of the individual. And that these requirements to isolate and then re-enter, and this sensitivity to spiritual imbalance was sometimes a sign for the rabbis of inner sin that had to be addressed, but many times quite the opposite. It was for doing things that were important, but nevertheless affect us spiritually and emotionally. Okay, let's take.
Question. 1 second before you move on.
Okay, Aviva, can you turn your camera on?
No, I can't.
Okay.
You can hear my question.
If you turn your camera on, we'll know what color your roots really are, Aviva. I know why you're not doing
I'm
that.
in my nightgown. So what I want to say is when you give birth, if you give birth to a woman, you isolate for longer than if you give birth to a boy.
Yes.
Why?
So
I think I think the explanation was kind of a double dose, of a woman giving birth to a woman, but I don't really know. And I don't want to get too sidetracked in this. The point is only that there's a mind-body connection being made by our ancestors and by the rabbis. And I think that's the important point, because I want to eventually, of course, we're going to lead this back to the COVID-19 situation and our isolation and what it might mean for us as individuals and a society, and how it's both a physical and a spiritual disorder that it might be revealing. I think our ancestors knew a lot about the connection between disease and societies and what diseases reveal about societies and about individuals. So we're going to get into that. Let me see if there are any other hands up or questions. Talia, go ahead and unmute, or Don, if you could unmute, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. So I was thinking about the innocent that, if disease or a plague affects babies or affects like a healthy individual that was spiritually healthy, that typically that's something that is more of a generational or something that's handed. So if the parents spray the house with Raid, and then later a child who lives a spiritual life gets cancer, that may have been the catalyst. And so it's like we are responsible for not only living a spiritual, healthy life, but to make sure that it's given to the future generations.
Societies can be spiritually unbalanced, for sure. I think that, we've all felt that this quarantine has revealed some of the spiritual imbalance in our own personal lives, and in our relationships and in our city and in our country and in the world. So I think, yes, there is. I think this has been an extraordinary demonstration of the interconnected nature of humanity. And it's something that we were moving away from rather than toward. We were moving further toward balkanization and isolation in a negative way. And I do think this is somewhat of a wake-up call in terms of how interdependent we actually are on each other and the world. And that it really, we throw these phrases around, one world and one God, but it's really true for better and for worse. Any other questions about this basic first fundamental understanding of the two different ways our ancestors saw disease? Because then I want to move on into the text if I can. Everybody okay? Okay, all right. You know, they should develop some way that you can see what everybody's wearing underneath their normal clothes on top. Who's wearing sweatpants? Everybody. Okay, all right, let's go on. Now let's jump into the actual Torah portion now that we have this sort of basic way of understanding these two senses of disease. So this week's Torah portion deals with this disease called tzara'at, which is often translated as leprosy, but we know it wasn't leprosy because it doesn't really mimic the symptoms of leprosy. So we'll just call it by its Hebrew name, tzara'at, okay? And this was a white, scaly skin disease. And when it was discovered on a person, the priest, who was also the medicine man, which is why we don't always know whether it was viewed as a medical or spiritual affliction, the priest would examine the person, and get this, the person would isolate for 7 days, and then if necessary, another 7 days, a 14-day period of isolation, which is identical to what the protocol is today. So it shows us that our ancestors knew a lot about communicable disease, even though this isn't perceived as a communicable disease. Now, I'm going to get a little geeky with you about the language. If those of you have your Bibles, look at Leviticus 13:4. Okay, Leviticus 13:4. And those of you who don't have a Bible, listen to what I'm saying really carefully. Listen to the words. Okay. After the priest examines the person, listen to this. The priest shall isolate the affliction for 7 days. The priest shall isolate the affliction for 7 days. Now, why am I making such a big deal out of that verbiage? The priest shall isolate the affliction for 7 days. What would you have expected it to say? Anybody?
Yeah,
The person, Jody, say it again.
I was just gonna say, I would expect it to be that they isolate the person, not
Correct.
the disease.
Correct, correct. That you would expect it to say the priest isolated the afflicted, right? Not the affliction. I think this is a colossally important point. I don't know if colossally is a word, but it is now. I think this point is colossal. And I want to see if anybody can help me, kind of get into my mind. Why do I think it's so important that the Torah says the affliction was isolated, not the afflicted? Go ahead, Merle.
Because I'm thinking that the person's not a bad person for having, you're not isolating the individual, you're protecting society from the disease, not the person.
Yes, we do not define the person
Right.
by his or her disease.
Okay.
We honor, I'll get you in a second, Abby. We honor the individuality of the afflicted. And this is a way, I think, of recognizing that every single statistic on that screen every night as we watch the news, every one of those numbers is a unique, valuable, important individual, human being. That the person is not the disease, and the disease is not the person. And therefore, this language to me is not a small matter at all. I think it's the essence of the Jewish view. Now, Abby, I saw you had your hand up.
Well, because I have the JPS 2,
Yeah.
which says the priest shall isolate the afflicted person for 7 days.
Yeah, it's an incorrect.
Well, it's the JPS 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder
Roy.
what.
Roy, you gotta unmute, Roy.
Okay, well, I'll mute.
No, Roy, yeah, you mute Abby, and Roy, you unmute. Can someone unmute Roy?
I got
Maybe
it.
I can. There we
Yeah, I
go.
got
Go
it.
ahead.
Yeah, precisely what the previous person said is that the translation is important, because I have two different versions of the Tanakh, and each one indicates that the person is being isolated, not the disease.
Yeah. Well, I'm just telling you, every translation
Yes,
is
it
an
means I have to go to. I have to continue with Torah study to get it right.
Yeah, you gotta learn Hebrew. So it's an important point, and it is also an important translation point to be considered. So let's go with my translation, because otherwise I don't have much of a sermon for you today. So, but I do think separating. Look, I think it's important to separate these two. Otherwise, it's those people, or it's a disease of those people. It's the Chinese, it's the Italians, it's brown people and black people. Every single number on that screen is a unique individual who should not be defined by his or her disease. By the way, this is true of all people with all diseases. We don't want to be defined by our disease. We may be affected by it, but we and the disease are not one. And I think this is crucial. And let me just, so many of you know this, but there's a Mishnah. It's in the Talmud, Sanhedrin, and so many of you know this. If you saw Schindler's List, you know this. This is the Mishnah that talks about the fact that if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved the entire world. If you have saved a single life, it is as if you have saved the entire world, because every life is its own world of connections and love, and the source of, and both the result of other lives that came before and the source of lives that came after. So this idea of the importance of the individual, the uniqueness of the individual, the sanctity of the individual, it all comes from this beautiful idea that we quarantine the affliction and we don't define the afflicted by it. My wife's unfortunately had cancer twice. A lot of you on this screen have had and do have cancer and other diseases. And there are people who literally move away from other people who have cancer, which is so sad and absurd, really. But there, we have to differentiate between the disease and the person. So, this verse, Leviticus 13:4, I think is very, very, very significant. Okay, now let's go. Any questions about that? We're doing okay? Everybody, Bernd, I saw you. You got to unmute. Unmute, lower left hand. Don, do you see where it says Plato guest? There you go, you're good.
I was going to say, since, as you know, I speak Hebrew,
Yes.
As far as 4 is concerned, it does say et hanega, which of course means the disease. Not
That's right.
Yeah. But it is mistranslated in all of these other paragraphs.
These are, yeah. And nega means plague almost. So there's no question, there's no doubt about what the Hebrew says. You're just dealing with translations that were actually interpretations more than translations, I would have to say. Go ahead, Merle.
As an example of people moving away from people, the example you used was cancer. But when I was diagnosed with diabetes 30 years ago, there were people that got very upset if they were out for dinner with us or if we were going to a dinner party. And I asked what the chef or the caterer used. There were people that would make something for me and say, don't tell anyone else here that it's no sugar or that you're diabetic, like I was some transmittable disease.
Yeah. No, this is a real.
It's real.
Yeah, it's real. And it was real then. Now, so let's jump ahead. I don't even know what time it is. Okay, but all right, let's jump ahead. Here we go. I want to move on to the next now. And to really give you the meat of how the rabbis, what most of the rabbis spend most of their energy on commenting about this Torah portion and this disease. So the first time we kind of hear of this disease in the Torah is when Miriam is afflicted by this white scaly, skin disease. And it happens when Miriam is gossiping about Moses's wife, who is a Cushite woman, a woman from Ethiopia, a Black African woman. And Moses's sister and brother, Miriam and Aaron, weren't too pleased with his choice, and they were gossiping about her. And then Miriam is afflicted with this white scaly disease. So the rabbis have always associated this particular disease as a disease that is punishment or a sign that one needs to repent from evil speech, from lashon hara, from gossip. And it leads to a whole treatise in the Talmud about the dangers of gossip. How gossip actually, in the Talmud, the gossip is compared, it's tantamount to murder. Because you can destroy a person's life with gossip. You can ruin a person's life with gossip. And by the way, just as I think an important side point, very often people will say to me, but Rabbi, it's not gossip, it's true. The Talmud defines it as gossip, even if it's true. Anything you say that would hurt another person is considered gossip, even if it's true. Okay, so it's all gossip. And Miriam gossips, and she's afflicted with this skin disease. And so this is the spiritual malady, the sin, the punishment, that then the rabbis go on for 20 centuries, basically, to attach to this disease. Now, that's, to me, kind of the simple point. Here's another, I think, really beautiful and interesting point. So, of course, when Miriam has this disease, she has to go through this procedure of being isolated for 7 days and then checked, and then another 7 days. And in the Midrash, this collection of writings of the rabbis about the Torah, this happens to be Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. It's a pretty famous collection of Midrashim, called the Mechilta for short. So in the Mechilta, it makes the point that when Miriam was isolated, the entire camp of Israelites stayed put. They didn't move forward on their journey while Miriam was isolated. So as the Torah tells us, when there was a cloud over the camp, the people stayed put. When the cloud lifted, they moved camp and continued their journey through the desert. Sometimes the clouds lasted for a day, a week, a month, or even years. But they stayed hunkered down while the cloud was over the camp. When Miriam was in isolation, the Midrash says there was a cloud over the camp and the people stayed put and they waited for her to heal. They did not, how should I put it, leave her behind, right? And I think this too is a very powerful message for today, that we can't just move on. We can't leave people behind. And you can extend the idea of leaving people behind as narrowly or broadly as you wish. I think in the most narrow sense, we don't leave our family and our friends behind during this isolation. We keep reaching out, we keep staying in touch. I'm trying to call my mother more often than I normally would. I'm texting and calling my siblings more. I'm reaching out to my friends in New York more, my friends in Italy more. So I think in the most narrow sense, we don't leave people behind while the cloud is over the camp and people are isolated in the narrow personal sense. But I think it also can be extended and should be extended in a much broader way to people who are suffering so terribly right now. You know, we're doing everything we can through the Car Center to feed people and get them diapers. I was on a Zoom conversation 2 days ago with the woman who runs Baby to Baby. She belongs to the temple. I've known her since she was a little girl. And FEMA is calling Baby to Baby for baby formula because they can't get enough of it because the need is so great and people can't afford it. Baby formula, diapers, food. This is another way of not just moving on when other people are suffering. This is another way of hunkering down and waiting and helping. Betsy's here right now with me at home, and she's in our dining room, and the table's been turned into a mask making factory. So she's sewing masks right now. These are all, I think, tangible and real examples that extend this biblical notion of not leaving people behind who are suffering. There's a difference between isolating people and abandoning people. So we're all isolated, but that does not give us the right to abandon, particularly the most vulnerable. End of sermon. Any comments, hands? Then we're going to move on to part 3. Everybody, I'm looking at both. Hey, Steve and Dana. Hi, guys. Let's see. Any other hands up? Okay. You're such a quiet bunch today. I don't know. Okay. All right. Now let's continue into the Torah portion a little further. I'm going to talk about one more thing and then open it up for any questions about what we've talked about or anything in general. Now, let's talk about re-entry, because this is such a big topic right now. My son just came in a few minutes ago and said Spain is reopening. I don't know exactly what that means, but at some point we are going to get our arms around this process of re-entering. So I thought it might be interesting to look at the biblical process for re-entering when after quarantine and after healing. How did our ancestors bring a person back into the community? And is there anything for us to learn from that as we, at this point, only fantasize about normal life again? But in addition to fantasizing about it, how should we approach it when we actually get that opportunity to re-enter a more normal existence? So there was what I would call a purification process after the physical signs of a person's affliction were gone. Okay. Now, one of them was that there was a kind of a sacrifice of 2 birds. One was sacrificed and one was allowed to fly away. So the rabbis, of course, I shouldn't say of course, because you haven't studied it, but one of the reasons the rabbis give for the birds is that birds start tweeting first thing in the morning and they tweet and chirp all day long. They're the most gossipy of animals. And remember that the rabbis saw this as a punishment for gossip. And so you slaughter the birds as a reminder to do away with gossip. You set one free and you slaughter one as a reminder to do away with gossip. I think that's a little metaphorical and overly symbolic, but that is the interpretation that the rabbis give. So one of these birds was slaughtered, and then, interestingly enough, the blood of the bird was placed on the person who was afflicted, on the ear, the thumb, and the toe. Think about this for a moment. Placing of blood on your ear, your thumb, and your toe. Does anybody want to take a shot at what the symbolic importance of those 3 locations might be? Ear, thumb, toe. Yeah, Hank, go ahead, unmute yourself, and then we'll go to Carol.
I would assume the ear reflects the fact that you are hearing the gossip.
Yes, okay. Next time you hear something and you're tempted to gossip, no. Carol, go ahead.
Oh, is it only specific to gossip or to going forward and reentry?
It's however you see it.
I see it as hearing. Thumb is the opposability of the thumb differentiates us from all the other mammals. We can make and do things. So hearing, doing something about it, and traveling, walking, being mobile, they're very distinctive parts of the body.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's that we should remember that isolation, remember that affliction, remember its lessons. I know that we're all different people on this Zoom, and we're all learning different lessons, but we're all learning something as a result of this experience. Some of us have lessons in common. Some of us are learning our own unique lessons. I think that this idea of the ear, the thumb, and the feet is this reminder that you should take this with you back into the world, in your words and in your deeds. What you do with your hands, where you go, where you put yourself in life, and how you listen to others and how you continue to hear the echo. You know, there's a lot of talk about the economic echo effect of this crisis. I hope there is an echo effect that isn't economic. I hope there's an echo effect that we continue to hear in our ears and in our minds and with our lives, the lessons that we're learning right now about who and what really matters and who and what really don't matter very much at all. So I think, yes, that's a big part of it. Now, there's another part of this re-entry purification ritual that involves using cedar wood and hyssop. I don't know if any of you have ever seen hyssop, but it's a very small plant. And a cedar tree in the Middle East, in the ancient Near East, was the tallest of trees. Anybody want to take a shot at the metaphorical importance of using cedar and hyssop? Yeah, Bernd, go ahead. Unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Got it.
There you go. Go ahead.
In the Bible class, we mentioned the cedar, by the way, is a tree that also provides all kinds of helpful chemicals. For example, moths are deterred by it. And in the Bible, it mentions that cedar is put in bitter water in order to sweeten it.
Yeah, but what, in this case, what do you think the cedar might represent? Assuming that the rabbis, you know, from the rabbis' mindset, which saw this affliction as the result of a spiritual imbalance and impurity.
Well, the cedars were also used to build the temple. So
it's the tallest tree. You're right about all that. It's not what the rabbis hit on. Okay, I'll just lay it out for you. The cedar is a symbol of haughtiness, of arrogance, because it towers over everything else. And you know, so this was a reminder, and the hyssop, of course, the smallest. And so this was seen by the rabbis as a reminder to hold on to the humility that affliction brings. I mean, any of us, I think we've all been humbled by a pretty serious degree by this virus. You know, I think that's the source of much of the anxiety too, is this recognition that, you know what, there's nothing so special about any of us. We're all susceptible and we're all in this. So the question is, will you hold on to that reminder of our vulnerability and humility when this is all over and we can all get back into our cars and be at war again on the 405 with each other? Will we hold on to that remembrance? You know, will we continue to hear in a new way and to behave in new ways? And I hope so. I know the economic echo effect is going to be terrible. I hope that the spiritual and moral echo effect will be very beautiful and very powerful. So I want to end with that in terms of teaching specifically about the Torah portion. And let me open it up now for any. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I've got another. I'm doing something crazy at 1:15 with a big Christian evangelical broadcast, and we're going to talk about plagues. So I'm going to kind of talk about some of the stuff that we just talked about, because obviously the understanding of plagues there is very different. So any questions? Yeah, Linda, go ahead and be sure you unmute yourself.
In your talking about reentry, I was thinking about, I actually have a friend who just yesterday got off a ventilator. She's been on
Wow.
a ventilator in New York since the middle of March.
Wow.
And it's like a miracle. This woman wants to live.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting as we learn about all these things. She was brought in really early. And so she's been able to overcome it, where some people come in too late and they really can't. But like we think of reentry as being able to go to the movies or to the theater or whatever,
Yeah.
where reentry for her is getting off the ventilator and pretty soon she'll be able to walk and talk again.
Yeah. And let me tell you the psychological effects. Any of us who've ever had a long illness, and many of us on these screens have suffered long illnesses. We know this gets back to how we began. We know the spiritual imbalance that kind of fight creates within us. We know the fear that it creates, the exhaustion that it creates, the sense of isolation and abandonment that it creates, the sense of vulnerability that it creates. And reentry is a long road back. So this idea of people who went through spiritually challenging experiences needing emotional time to isolate and decompress before reentering is actually, I think, a very sophisticated and sensitive idea, and very wise. And your friend, who is a walking miracle, or soon to be walking miracle. Yes, reentry for her will take months, if not years. And you're right. It's more for, and reentry means something different to different people. Okay, I want to see any other hands up. How are we doing? You're not a very talkative group today. This format has muzzled all of you. It's terrible. Okay. I think, oh yeah, Talia, go ahead, unmute.
Hi. So I've found in this that the things that I was letting go of before this global pandemic hit, as far as letting myself not judge. Let's say if I'm working at a soup kitchen and there's someone walks in with a fresh tattoo and their hair, all done, it's not up to me to judge. Maybe they have a friend that did the tattoo for them for free. It's just like not a matter of judgment. If someone comes in a suit with keys, they might be living in their car. Not for me to judge. I get that. But in isolation, I found myself like noticing, like on that Saturday night Cedar video, like how are these women keeping up these amazing manicures, and how are people like and starting to look at who isn't staying in quarantine and who's having their kids come and go, and who's, and then there's people who are not letting their mother see their new baby because they're honoring and respecting. So I'm trying so hard to like not judge in isolation. That's like been a challenge because I just see it's like not for me to judge. It's like people are doing the best they can, but I still go there. And
I can tell you, maybe, I don't know if this will make you feel better or worse, but you have permission to judge from a Jewish perspective because these people are endangering other people's lives. And the endangering another person's life is the absolute, short of murder, the worst kind of sin from the perspective of Jewish law. When it comes to protecting life, with 3 exceptions, you break every other mitzvah in order to protect life. So I think if you're witness to behavior that is endangering the lives of others, Jewish law would say you should be judgmental about that. There is no good reason for that.
What are the 3 exceptions, Steve?
So you are allowed to break all Jewish laws in order to save a life, with 3 exceptions, okay? The first is committing public apostasy. So if the Nazis, for example, came to me, the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, put a gun to my head and said, you have to get up on the bima on Kol Nidre and profess your belief in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, publicly profess and convert, I have to take the bullet. So that's the first case. The second case is a host of sexual crimes. You're not allowed, for example, if a Nazi put a gun to my head and said, you have to rape this woman or we're going to shoot you, I have to take the bullet. Okay? Incest, rape, a whole host of sexual crimes. The third is murder. If someone puts a gun to my head and says, you have to shoot Carl or we're going to shoot you, I have to take the bullet. But short of those three very extreme circumstances, you can break any rule in order to save a life. So the opposite must also be true. You have to observe any rule that would save a life. And that's the answer to Talia's point. So those are the three. Yes, Merle.
So does that give us permission when somebody is making a comment about an inappropriate comment where this isolation is concerned and people and what they're doing or not doing, how they're acting, does that give us permission to tell those people you're wrong?
Yeah.
And cool.
Rabbi?
Yes. Who's talking?
Sukasa.
Oh, Sukasa. Okay, go ahead.
I'm wondering, going back to what you said about people needing time to reintegrate and so forth. Many people, a lot of us, all of us at some time in our life will go through terrible tragedy. Some people are better at reintegrating, better at going through the process. What do you think the keys are to making that happen?
To helping a person reintegrate?
Well, in other words, you see some people, they've had cancer, they go through the healing process and they reintegrate into life. Other people hold on to the cancer.
Yeah.
So what is the key?
Well, so here's the thing. Heinrich Heine made this joke about the Jews. He said the Jews are like everyone else, just more so, which I love, right? The Jews are like everyone else, just more so. I think disease makes us more so. I think that person who, sees him or herself only as a victim, from cancer, for example, only as a victim. I mean, you are a victim and it's terrible, but only as a victim, who takes on the persona as victim, probably had that persona beforehand, and the cancer made it more so. So I don't think disease gives anyone a new personality. It heightens the personality that already exists. I see my friend Deborah Davidson is there. Deborah, are you with us?
Risa.
Can you unmute, Deborah? Okay, so Deborah's a psychologist, so I'm interested in her view on this as well. So I was just saying, Deborah, that disease doesn't really change people's personalities. It makes them more so. It intensifies those personalities. Would you agree with that?
I think it depends on the person, but I think also Dana weighed in and said, maybe the question is about what makes people more resilient or flexible. But I do think that these illnesses make us feel really, like you mentioned earlier, vulnerable and hopefully humbled by it. And hopefully, whether it's cancer or COVID or whatever, that we take a moment. There are articles written about the great pause and that what do we go back to and what do we leave behind?
Yeah.
So, I think it really depends on the person, what they take away from it. And as far as being stuck, I mean, I think it has to do with things that have happened earlier or what other challenges the person is dealing with and what resources they have.
Yeah. It has as much to do about the past as it does the present. I think that's, exactly right. Risa, go ahead.
I think we have to add the mikveh to this because the entire mikveh experience is to help you re-enter. Yes. And there are plenty of new blessings for everything, from illness to whatever it is. Re-entry requires looking into yourself.
Yes, and the mikvah is generally a solitary experience in those circumstances. It's something you do alone unless it's for conversion purposes when you have to have witnesses. But Yeah, it's private. It's beautiful. I think that's right. You know, water. Many religions use water as something that transforms your status. You go in as one thing, you come out as something else. It's a change of status. And I mean, there's no more graphic example of a reentry than that, right? You were sick before and now you're not. So I think mikveh, yeah, it's later, but yes, absolutely. Very good. Let's see. So Sukasa, I hope we answered your question to some degree. There's a really interesting book that your question reminded me of, for those of you who might want to look at it. It's called Stumbling on Happiness. And it's written by Daniel Gilbert, who's a psychologist. And his thesis is basically that we're all born with a kind of default, or by a young age, we arrive at a default happiness setting. And that no matter what happens to us, we eventually go back to that default setting. So he studied, for example, a large number of people. He measured their happiness quotient. Let's say I was a 7 and, you know, Robert's an 8 and, you know, Valerie's a 3, whatever. We all have this setting, right? And then within this cohort that he studied, a few people had limbs amputated for medical reasons, and a few people won the lottery in this group. And he studied them immediately after this event. And the people who had amputations, their happiness quotient dropped. And the people who won the lottery, it shot way up. Then he studied them a year later, and everyone's quotient, everyone was back to their default setting. So these things that happen tend to create temporary changes, not permanent changes. And the challenge here is going to be, can this pandemic create some positive and permanent changes in all of us and in the world? That's what I'm starting to think about. I like thinking about that because it's hopeful and positive, as opposed to what are the negative changes from which we will never recover. And I'm sure there'll be some of those too. Let's see, we've got time for 1 or 2 more if I see any hands. Susan, go ahead. Yes. Susan Ehrlich.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you, yes.
There is a positive thing. First of all, a silver lining to some of this, but I also feel every time that I came back, now it wasn't a life thing, but every time I came out of an injury or a sickness, I felt so good that, you know, hey, look at me, I'm walking around, you know, it's an affirmative that this is past, and then also thankful. And
yeah.
Thankful, and you know.
Yes.
Thank you, God. Thank you so much for healing me.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's less traffic now. People are working from their home. They're Zooming.
Yeah.
Work, they're Zooming family.
Yeah.
Mode of communicating and connecting is there. Maybe businesses will start letting people that flex time.
Yes. Look, not to diminish the pain and suffering. Susan, Deborah asked if I would repeat. I didn't hear all of what Susan said, but I think basically what she was saying was there are some very beautiful things evolving and appearing as a result of a very terrible thing. And that we want to hold on to some of that if we can. I call this is just again to get a little bit eggheady about this. There's this theological concept in Latin, via negationis, which means by the negative, by way of the negative. Stan Davids is watching. He's a great rabbi, and he knows this. It's called, in English, we would call it negative theology. That you can understand what God is by understanding first what God is not. Think of this like a sculpture. If you think about a sculpture, it started as a block of marble, and the sculpture was created by removing things, not by adding things. That the sculpture and the beauty was always within, it's just a lot of other crap had to be moved out of the way for us to see it. And that's true of what this isolation has done. And I think is Susan's point, that it's removed a lot of things, and in their absence, something very beautiful is flourishing, and that is not to dismiss or ignore the other very terrible things that are flourishing, the death and the disease and the economic tragedy. But it is also true that some very beautiful things are emerging and things that we took for granted. I'll just tell you, this is the tiniest thing, but any of you who like baseball will understand it. 3 nights ago, late in the early evening, we're quarantined with our 30-year-old son, Aaron. We found our old baseball mitts and a ball, and we played catch in the backyard, which we haven't done for 15 years. And we didn't have to talk at all. It was just two guys throwing the ball around, and that said everything that needed to be said, you know, about our connection and love for each other and the fun we had when he was young. I haven't played catch with Aaron for 15 years. And is it worth all the pain and suffering for me to play catch with my kid in the backyard? No, it's not worth it, but it's not worthless either. You know, let's make something of this. And ideally, just to put a ribbon on it all, like that blood on the ear, the thumb, and the toe, ideally, let it be a permanent part of our lives going forward. Let the beautiful part of this remain. That would be a great victory. So with that being said, I want to wish you all, let's unmute everybody, Don, and we can all wish each other a Shabbat Shalom, okay? Everybody unmute.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shalom.
I miss you all. I miss you all.
Rabbi.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for a beautiful morning.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for a beautiful session, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Hey, Carly, I got your notes about John Prine. I agree. Carly, can you hear me?